I'm Blakely, and today we're going to be discussing personality disorders. So, what are personality disorders, you may ask? They are a class of mental disorders characterized by enduring maladaptive patterns of behavior, cognition, and inner experience. They are anatomic features typical to the brains of individuals with cluster B personality disorders. For example, abnormalities in the superior frontal cortex of the brain. Emotional dysregulation and impulsiveness are two prominent symptoms, and hereditary factors may contribute to the development of these conditions. So there are actually 5 types of classical personality disorders, and these types are going to be schizoid personality disorders, paranoid personality disorders, antisocial personality disorders, histrionic personality disorders, and obsessive-compulsive disorders. This is more commonly known as OCD, and I myself actually do have OCD. So throughout this presentation, I will let you in on a little insight of a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and I'll go through a couple symptoms or habits that I may have that may be prominent in other patients or people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, just so you can get a little insight of a day in life. So going through the diagnosis of personality disorders. They require a careful clinical history and physical and neurological examination, as well as mental status examination. These personalities must also display a pattern of exerting control on the individual's behavior. Extensive and unusual loss of memory is more common with people with personality disorders. I myself actually do have a very, very bad memory, and I did figure out when I was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder that it is a symptom, and it kind of explained everything for me. So a lot of times when I have something very important that I have to remember, I do have to write it down, or even set a reminder on my phone. That way it tells me immediately a couple days before something is due, or a couple days before I have something that I need to get done. Or even I've done this quite a lot, like an hour before something happens, or maybe 2 or 3 hours, so I remember and I can get ready for it so I don't forget. Differential diagnosis generally involves ruling out the effects of chemical substances and medical conditions. So going through the diagnosis can kind of help us figure out if it is a medical condition or if it's due to a chemical substance or things like that. When evaluating children, we do have to keep in mind that children do participate in imaginary play a lot. As a child, you may have had an imaginary friend, or you may have thought that you lived in a giant castle in Disneyland and you were Princess Aurora. So we do have to keep in mind that children do have imaginary play a lot because they have huge imaginations and they're very creative, and a lot of that can be normal in children. So when going through the diagnosis, it is important to remember that. Now moving on to the types of personality disorders and what these people may present with these disorders. So when going through schizoid personality disorders, they have a preference to do things alone. Oftentimes they are humorless. They have no sense of humor. They do not participate in other sense of humor when shown either. They can be distant or cold in mannerisms, and they lack interest of hobbies. If they do have a hobby, it's more than often than not something that they like to do alone, as if they were reading a book alone in the bed alone at home. With paranoid personality disorders, these people can be insecure. They can tend not to be able to relax. They have little to no sense of humor, so they may participate a little bit more than people with schizoid personality disorders and other people's humor, or they may give a little bit more with their own humor, but more often than not, it's very rare that they do. They can be pathologically jealous and show a lot of anger and hostility towards even themselves, but also others. So if something doesn't go their way or something is said they do not agree with, a lot of times they will show some anger and hostility with it. And when they do tend to get jealous, because that is also a symptom, it can cause a lot of anger and hostility as well. Moving on to antisocial personality disorders, they have very, very poor impulse control. And people with these disorders can show that they avoid responsibility for their own actions. A lot of times they seem to blame others. And they do require constant stimulation. So unlike schizoid and paranoid personality disorders, they do tend to do a lot of things and maybe have a little bit more hobbies and interests because it keeps that stimulation on their brain. Moving on to histrionic personality disorders, this is more prevalent in females, and they can have a very immature personality and they crave to be the center of attention. They are also very sexually provocative and they are egocentric. So they do tend to think that things are always about them, and if they are not the center of attention during something, they do tend to create themselves as center of attention. Moving on to obsessive compulsive disorder, as I said earlier in the presentation, I do have this, and I can say that I do show a lot of these symptoms. Over-concern with details is going to be one of them. They tend to be perfectionists, and they're rigid and inflexible. Saying that they are rigid and inflexible is saying that if they have something planned, they're going to want it to happen. And if they have something planned and something gets canceled, they're going to be very upset, very frustrated, maybe even a little bit angry because that was not their plan and that is not how they planned around their day. They can tend to be humorless, and they are very indecisive and have emotional constriction. Emotional constriction, I myself do tend to have this a lot or show this a lot. They tend to act as if they do not have feelings or as others do not have feelings. And I actually struggle with this a lot. It's one of my more shown symptoms. So when I tend to have relationships with people, I tend to think in my head that they do not have feelings. So just from a personal experience, being in a relationship, a lot of times I do not think that the person that I am in a relationship has feelings. And not saying that as if I think that they cannot get upset or their feelings won't get hurt. I tend to think that they do not have any feelings towards me, that they don't actually love me, that they're not actually interested in me. And obviously they are, because they're devoting all this time and energy towards me, but in my head, I tend to make myself believe that they have absolutely no interest in me. Another thing with being a perfectionist, I am definitely a perfectionist. I pay attention to every single little detail, and it has to be perfect. I actually live on my own, and I can tell you that my pantry, my fridge, and every single one of my cabinets are organized to the T. I have labels on all my containers in my pantry. And as soon as I have guests over, if they do go in my pantry, as soon as they close that cabinet or close the fridge, I will run to the cabinet or run to the fridge just to make sure that everything's still organized. And if it's not, I will organize it right there no matter what we are doing. So just so you can get a little insight of someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, as I've said, not everyone with personality disorders are going to have the same symptoms, but this is just something that I go through every day. It's not super hard to manage for myself, but others it may be a little bit harder or maybe even a little bit easier. So why do we recognize personality disorders? We can recognize them in the psychiatric setting, or we can recognize them in the medical setting. So in the psychiatric setting, they're considered axis 2 and can be present concurrently with other personality disorders or psychiatric disorders. So whenever we're recognizing them in a psychiatric setting, we're also looking to see if they do have any other psychiatric disorders, because oftentimes they are linked. They do have a compliance to treatment and choice of therapy, and they're egocentric in the majority of cases as well. In the medical setting, different types of personality disorders react differently to their illness, doctor, and treatment plans. So someone with histrionic personality disorders may not react the same way to their illness, doctor, and treatment plans as someone with obsessive compulsive disorder will. So going into that a little bit, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder personalities would question every single detail about their treatment plan. I for sure know I would. I would want to know every single in, every single out. I would know what is in this medicine, what it does, what it's for, why it's in there. And I actually am on medicine for my obsessive compulsive disorder, and that is exactly how I acted whenever I did get medication for it, because I knew that I had it, and it was not hard for me to admit that I had it. But being on medication, just for someone with obsessive compulsive disorder in general, is a little bit weary, and it does actually make me a little bit nervous, because obviously medications involve a lot of ingredients, and I like to research literally every single ingredient so that I can know why it's in there, what it's doing to my body, and what's going on with it. So people with histrionic personality disorders will often dramatize their complaints. So let's say they're going into the doctor, they get diagnosed with this disorder, and they're getting told why, like, what symptoms they have with this disorder, and they're saying that the person that is telling them this, so the doctor, is just being dramatic, and that those symptoms are normal, they're not symptoms of this disorder at all. Whereas people with paranoid personality disorders, they'll question the doctor's fees and their attitudes. Oftentimes they would say that they're only saying they have the disorder because they want to get their money, or they want to put something on the record so that they have another diagnosis. There's just a few things that would show with these disorders whenever getting diagnosed. So going through the treatment of personality disorders, you can go through psychotherapy or medication or both. So psychotherapy, the modality and type is chosen according to the individual patient and their disorder. Techniques vary from cognitive, behavioral, brief dynamic, and extended deeper forms. As if group therapy can be extremely helpful in certain types, such as schizoid disorders, individual psychotherapy is a lot more helpful in certain cases, such as paranoid personality disorders. And medication for concurrent axis 1 disorders, such as depression or anxiety, and for certain behaviors that need to be controlled, such as violence. In antisocial personality disorder, they can be managed by mood stabilizers. And obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, SSRIs are very, very helpful. Moving on to media. A lot of times any kind of disorder can be misconstrued in the media, because we do see a lot of disorders every day in TV shows, movies, and things like that. And with personality disorders, there was an extremely popular movie released in 2017. It was called Split. You may have seen it. I know I myself did go to the movie theater to see it with a couple of friends. And basically in this movie, we do follow this one man. He is a grown man, and he suffers from DID. So what is DID? DID is dissociative identity disorder, and it causes people to have multiple personalities. More commonly, people do have around 11 up to 24 personality disorders. In some cases, even more, even less, but that's what's most common. And these personalities can be male or female, from any culture, any religion. They can have their own beliefs that are different from another personality this person may have. And it's a very, very extensive disorder. So throughout this movie, we do follow this man that has this disorder, and he has 24 personalities. One of these personalities is extremely violent and goes on to abduct 3 girls that he has no clue who they are throughout the movie. And this movie does show DID in good ways and in bad. So it does a very, very good job at showing how many personalities a person with DID can have, and how quickly they can change from one personality to another. A lot of times, a certain sound, word, or image can trigger a person with DID to switch personalities, and this movie does show a great job at that. But this movie also made a lot of people upset because it gave DID a very, very violent image for those that have it. And I do believe that a lot of people with this disorder actually reached out to the filmmakers and let them know how upset this made them, because it did give people with DID a very, very bad rep, because a lot of people with DID are very, very rarely violent, and people with DID actually only make up about 1% of Americans, and you can see that source in my presentation as well. But it just gave people with this personality disorder almost a bad image for people that are not knowledgeable on the subject. It was a good movie, and it did show a good presentation of how many personalities a person with this disorder can have and how quickly, but it did do a little bit of negative work on this disorder as well. In many cultures, personality disorders are looked at different ways. For instance, in Japan, as you can see cited in my presentation, personality disorders aren't as common because they're not as researched. Whereas in America, they're more researched, and people are a lot more accepting, and just knowledgeable about the topic. So if you really don't have much knowledge on personality disorders, I highly encourage you to go do some research, learn a little bit about it, and see if you can just look at the perspective of people with personality disorders and understand those disorders, and maybe give a little bit more of people more time and patience with those disorders. So thank you for joining me for this presentation, and I hope you did learn something new about personality disorders.